l'opposition.
The Conservative Party is focusing on its common sense plan to cut taxes, build houses, fix budgets, and stop crime. The Prime Minister is not worth the cost or the corruption of a Arrive scam. The RCMP is investigating, and the Auditor General did, and the AG met with the police and said it would take a court order to get all the documents. Will the Prime Minister produce all the documents to the RCMP and the AG so that we can know the full truth? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our colleague is right to point out the important work done by the Auditor General. She tabled a damning report on Monday. We acknowledge that. Steps have been taken and more will follow soon. That said, all the information is transparent and shared with the RCMP, among others. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Auditor General said after she exposed the Arrive scam with this $60 million in spending she's been able to find, she says the RCMP, whom she just met about the scandal, will now have to go to court to get a production order to get all of the documents that the Prime Minister is covering up. If the Prime Minister really has nothing to hide in his Arrive scam affair, then why won't he release the documents to both the police and the parliamentary committees investigating so we can get to the bottom of this scandal?
The Honourable Minister for Public Works and
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After having thanked and lauded the work of the Auditor General, our colleague wouldn't certainly want to pretend that she is not able to do her job. Her integrity and her independence are essential to the work of the government. We are grateful for what she does, and we're grateful for what she will be able to continue doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, actually, she pointed out that she can't even total up the full cost of the Arrive scam app because many of the documents were still hidden from her, either because they've been destroyed by corrupt Liberal government officials or because the Prime Minister is having them hidden. And now the RCMP will have to get a production order to get all the documents that are being deprived of the parliamentary committees investigating. So once again, a simple yes or no question. Will the Prime Minister hand over every single document that refers to the Arrive scam or GC strategies, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition knows very well that our government is collaborating with parliamentary committees. The Office of the Auditor General, the Border Services Agency is doing an internal review and investigation with respect to many of these matters, and officials have from the very beginning referred to the RCMP any and all information where they think it might be appropriate for the RCMP to investigate. The government will always cooperate with these lawful authorities to ensure that they can do the work that Canadians properly expect them to do.
Always will.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Arrive scam scandal is so bad that even former NDP leader Tom Mulcair has taken note. He said, but with the revelations of the past few days, I have to face the facts. This is the first major Canadian political scandal since the sponsorship scandal, and it's likely to be even bigger. Given that the NDP's own former leader is saying this Prime Minister is not worth the cost or corruption, why are they keeping him in power?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we thought that that level of exaggeration would be exclusive to the Leader of the Opposition. I can't speak for Mr. Mulcair. What I can tell Canadians, Mr. Speaker, is that the government takes these circumstances extraordinarily seriously. We accept the recommendations of the Auditor General. We have at all times worked with parliamentary committees and senior officials to ensure they have the tools necessary to investigate these matters and, of course, to hold to account those that may have done something inappropriate.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaking of partisanship, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Housing unleashed a vicious attack on himself. He said the Liberal government is presiding over what he called a generational moral failure because so many people cannot find a place to live. A record number of 30 different homeless encampments in Halifax alone, his home province, after his Prime Minister doubled housing costs. Given that they admit they've caused this moral failure, will they reverse the policies that caused it and start building homes instead of bureaucracy?
L'honorable ministre.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais quand même...
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleague that on this side of the House, we support and work with the mayors in Quebec and the municipalities. On this side of the House, unlike when he was Minister of Housing, we're building actual housing units and we're working with Canadians to put roofs over their heads. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for La Prairie. The $60 million wasted on ArriveCan is just the tip of the iceberg. We now know GC Strategies, a company of two guys in a cottage, snagged 140 contracts worth $258 million under the Liberals. These same two rotten apples, under the name Corridal, nabbed 9 contracts worth $3.6 million under the Conservatives. Imagine 20 departments involved and $260 million in IT contracts to two guys who don't even do any IT work. When will there be an expanded investigation into the awarding of all these contracts since 2010?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for reminding us of the very difficult context we went through a few years ago in the largest pandemic in a century. Thousands of jobs were lost. Billions in economic activity were lost. We had to act quickly, and that was the main priority. That said, it's not an excuse, and it's still unacceptable that public servants didn't do their job properly.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for La Prairie. The Liberals are still looking for excuses when they should be looking for culprits. There needs to be an investigation of all contracts, but there also needs to be a clean sweep at the Border Services Agency. It makes no sense that an $80,000 app turned into a $60 million scandal without anyone cluing in. It makes no sense that public servants attended dinners and whiskey tastings with suppliers without a single supervisor twigging. This is a systemic problem. Is the government going to put CBSA under third-party management?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our colleague is quite right. There needed to be an investigation, and that is precisely what the Auditor General did in recent months. She was able to use all the information, and rightly so. We're very grateful for her report. Of course, we're very shocked by what it revealed, and that's all the more reason to put in place the important recommendations she made.
For 4 months, innocent Palestinians have pleaded for help. Close to 30,000 people, including children, have been killed. In Rafah, it is even worse. And all we hear from this Prime Minister are empty words. He's concerned, but he won't stop arms sales to Israel. He won't help Canadians fleeing Gaza, and he won't reinstate funding to UNRWA. Maybe the minister's parliamentary secretary should say publicly what he's clearly been saying privately, that UNRWA is the only organization that can help people in Gaza. When will the Liberals finally act to save Palestinian lives?
The Honourable Minister for International Development.
Mr. Speaker, only the NDP would consider the first Western government to move on humanitarian aid to not be enough. Only the NDP would think that adding an additional $40 million to get even more aid to the Palestinians is not enough. Only the NDP would think that us bringing like-minded countries to call for an immediate ceasefire is not enough. We've called for no military action in Rafah to protect 1.8 million civilians. We will take no lessons from the NDP on this.
The Honourable Member from Elmwood, Transcona.
Mr. Speaker, being a parent is hard work. It can be exhausting, and people shouldn't be punished for having a family. But new parents who are laid off through no fault of their own before, during, or after parental leave are denied access to the regular employment insurance benefits they paid for. Women still do most of the unpaid caregiving work for Canadian families, so this disproportionately affects them. It's a clear case of gender discrimination. New moms shouldn't have to cannibalize their EI benefits to get a mat leave, and the government shouldn't have to wait for a court order to do the right thing. So when are these Liberals going to get the job done and end this discrimination against women?
The Honourable Minister for Development.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my colleague's advocacy on this important issue. We have spoken about the ongoing work of modernizing our EI system, and our government continues to make progress on this. As my colleague is aware, Mr. Speaker, this particular issue is before the courts. But, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, we are supporting families, we are supporting parents, we are supporting women. Let's look at our child benefit, look at $10 a day childcare, look at all of the improvements we've made to the EI system, making sure that parents have more access to this. Mr. Speaker, we're going to deliver for families, we're going to deliver for women. That's what we're here to do. That's exactly what we're going to do.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, le ministre...
Mr. Speaker, the housing minister was warned that his policies would cause a massive shortage, is in hot water again because he admitted to the Finance Committee that his $4 billion Housing Accelerator Fund doesn't actually build any houses. 0 houses, 0 apartments built, and he even admitted that it wouldn't lead to future construction. So will he follow my plan, my common sense plan, which will encourage the municipalities to create more housing units?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the housing crisis requires a cooperative approach. What is the opposition leader's approach? He insults mayors in Quebec City, in Montreal, and all across Canada.
In a serious housing policy, Mr. Speaker. The Accelerator Fund, which he points to, is incenting change at the zoning level municipally. That is critical if we are going to see more supply. It's absolutely vital that we see more supply because that's what underpins the housing crisis in front of us. He is not serious.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Together with municipal politicians to block housing. In fact, this housing minister, who when he was immigration minister was warned his policies would lead to a massive shortage, and yet it went ahead with them anyway, made some incredible admissions yesterday at Finance Committee. He said, one, that his $4 billion accelerator fund has not completed any homes, and two, quote, it doesn't actually lead to the construction of specific homes. Why doesn't he instead follow my common sense plan to link municipal funding to housing construction so we can build homes and not bureaucracy?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
It's a shame, Mr. Speaker. He should follow the proceedings of the Finance Committee more closely because just a few months ago, officials there testified that his private member's bill, so-called, meant to build more housing, does exactly the opposite. He wants to tax home builders, Mr. Speaker. He wants to cut infrastructure that communities would require for housing purposes. His best idea, it would seem, to build more homes is to create some sort of 1-800 number where neighbors can rat on each other if they have concerns around NIMBY. It's not a serious approach, Mr. Speaker. He's never been serious about housing. He's playing games.
The Honourable Member from Regina Capel.
This Prime Minister is not worth the cost or the corruption, and his Arrive scam app is just like the Liberal government, costly and corrupt. Look at the facts. 2 buddies, a basement office, an IT company that does no IT work yet got a $20 million contract for IT, and now the Auditor General tells us that she can't track all the costs. Quote, we didn't find records to accurately show how much was spent on what, who did the work, or how and why decisions were made. Will the Prime Minister order his officials to turn over all the documents, stop blocking this investigation, and call for a full RCMP investigation?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, it may surprise my honourable friend, but the government doesn't actually direct the National Police
doesn't know that.
In terms of investigations. We have confidence, Mr. Speaker, that the RCMP will take the important responsibility they have seriously and do all the work that is required. We have complete faith in the RCMP's independence and in their ability to look into all these matters. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, our government is also always available to work with parliamentary committees, the Auditor General's office, to ensure that every document is available so that this important matter can be resolved.
No other government.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
They voted against calling in the Auditor General in the first place and blocked multiple attempts at committees to get to the truth. And while the rest of the country viewed the pandemic as a difficult time full of hardship, the Liberal government saw it as an opportunity to enrich their friends. They got caught funneling $1 billion to the WE organization. A former Liberal MP got a sole source contract worth millions for the pandemic, and now we find out that their app cost 750 times what it should have, didn't work, and wasn't needed. The Auditor General says the RCMP is going to have to get a court order to get the documents. Why should it take a warrant for Canadians to find out what they did with their money?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, it doesn't take a warrant for Canadians to see that our government has been transparent both with the Auditor General and our government has been transparent, Mr. Speaker, with parliamentary committees. The facts may bother my friend, but he knows very well that the Auditor General is empowered to do all of this important work. We've accepted the report of the Auditor General. We'd acted on a number of recommendations before receiving the report because we'd asked the procurement ombudsperson to look into this matter. And Mr. Speaker, we value the importance of respecting taxpayers' money and will always do that.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, where was the minister on November 1st, 2022? Because here in the House there was a vote. The official opposition, the member for Carleton, the leader of the Conservatives, asked that the Auditor General examine the situation at ArriveCan. And what did the Liberals do? What did the minister do? They voted against that motion. Now today, we're calling for access to all the documents. And if the minister wants to hide from that request again, he should do the opposite. The government should show some dignity for once and allow full light to be shed on the Arrive scam scandal. The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague is quite right to insist on how important the Auditor General's work is. She released a report with some troubling findings and some solid, sound recommendations. He says we're hiding behind something, but that's not true. We shared all the information with the RCMP and the AG, and we will with any other organization that needs access to that information. The honourable member, the good news is that, yes, the Auditor General was able to do her job. But the problem is that this government didn't want her to. Imagine if she hadn't been able to do her job. People might have thought ArriveCan was no big deal. But no, it's the biggest scandal in Canadian history. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. An $80,000 contract wound up costing at least $60 million. And it makes no sense. Where was the minister in November 2022 when we were calling for an investigation into this? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only did the Auditor General do her work, she did an excellent job of it, and we appreciate it. And it will help us to continue to put in place whatever we need to, even though it was a crisis and there was a requirement for urgent action, but a crisis is no excuse for not following the basic rules. Those should have continued to apply. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Quebec French Language Commissioner released a report that may shock the immigration minister, but will surprise no one in Quebec. Temporary immigration played a central role in the decline of the French language in Quebec. According to the commissioner, it would cost between $10 and $13 billion to integrate all newcomers. Needless to say, that's not sustainable. Among the commissioner's recommendations is one aimed directly at the federal government. Will the minister finally share the burden of settling asylum seekers among the provinces instead of contributing to the decline of French? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to point out that we already are transferring $5.2 billion to the government of Quebec, including for enculturation and language training. I hope the minister's not talking about deporting people who don't speak French to other parts of Canada. That would be illegal and inhumane. We know full well that we have more work to do and that Quebec's burden needs to be shared, and we will keep working at that. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. It's not credible. Those answers are not believable anymore. The commissioner went even further and proposed that the federal government redistribute asylum seekers among provinces on the basis of their language. Ottawa could encourage people with a knowledge of French to stay in Quebec, or, as the Bloc proposes, to head for French language minority communities. As for Anglophones, Ottawa could encourage them to move to an English-speaking province. That would facilitate their access to the job market, in addition to reducing the cost of language training. Doesn't the minister think that's an excellent idea? The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a slap in the face of all our efforts to resettle asylum seekers. This has to be done in a humanitarian and consenting way. Language is one factor among others. It shouldn't be the main factor. We all have more work to do. The federal government has a role to play. Ontario, Quebec, and all the other provinces as well. Thank you. The honourable member for La Pointe de l'Île. If French is on the decline at the federal level, it may be because the Liberals have never appointed so few Francophones to key positions, decision-making positions. Of supposedly bilingual positions, only 21% went to Francophones last year. That's the worst record since 2015. When the Liberal ministers make political appointments, they name unilingual Anglophones, and you wonder why French is disappearing at the federal level. Will Liberal ministers stop setting the example that it's okay to forget about French? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, defending French and promoting French is a priority for all Liberal members from Quebec and from outside Quebec, too. We made a lot of appointments to ensure that there are more women and Indigenous appointments, and we're doing more for French, and we're going to do more to promote Francophones. And why is that? Because it's fundamental to us. So while the Bloc is bickering and picking fights, we will proceed with what needs doing, and that is appointing more Francophones.
Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stated that his Arrive scam app would cost taxpayers $80,000. But in fact, it's 750 times more, over $60 million and climbing. Now, committees studying this scam have heard evidence of forgery, fraud, obstruction of justice, and breach of trust by government officials. The Arrive scam is just like the Prime Minister, not worth the cost, not worth the corruption. Will the Prime Minister finally stop the cover-up and join us to call on the RCMP to expand the investigation?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Public Works and Procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member is correct to pointing to the important work of parliamentary committees, which are called to do valuable work to support that of the government in making sure that even in times of crisis like the pandemic, proper rules are followed and known and monitored by all public servants, including those at the CBSA.
The Honourable Member from Brantford Brant.
What a complete, insincere answer. And it's a fraud on the Canadians. Since the Prime Minister took office, over $250 million have been given to GC Strategies, two guys working in their basement. $20 million alone for the Arrive scam. Criminality is rampant, with evidence committee has recently heard. The Arrive scam is just like the Prime Minister, not worth the cost, not worth the corruption. Fleeced taxpayers want an honest answer. Will the Prime Minister finally call on the RCMP to expand the investigation? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Public Works and Procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member pointed out again correctly to the importance of investigations. The good news is that there was an investigation by the Auditor General just a few weeks and months ago, and there was an important report tabled on Monday with findings that are totally unacceptable, even in the context of the worst pandemic that we have seen in over a century, the worst economic crisis that we've seen since the 1930s. The findings are unacceptable, and that's why we're going to keep implementing all the recommendations of the Auditor General's report.
Good answer.
The honourable member for Montmagny, Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this government is not worth the cost or the corruption. It gave the ArriveCAN contract to GC Strategies, a company with 4 employees that doesn't do any IT work, for an app that was supposed to cost 80 grand, but may have cost over $60 million, 750 times more. That's what I call gross incompetence. But politically, Mr. Speaker, who's going to take responsibility for this incompetence? And when are we going to get our money back? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member mentioned responsibility or accountability. In times of crisis, a responsible government has 2 duties. One, to protect the health and safety of people, including tens of thousands of Quebecers and Canadians during the pandemic. And secondly, to ensure that goods and services could cross the border. There was international trade, billions of dollars worth of trade at stake, and we needed to make sure that that could continue to flow efficiently and usefully.
When the Minister of Environment said the government will stop investing in new road infrastructure, he made it very clear that he never considered northern communities. Many Indigenous communities still lack all weather roads. In fact, most of the communities in my riding are still using dust roads. For years, they have been calling on the government to invest in road infrastructure. I have a simple question. Why is the minister against Nunavut getting their roads paved?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I thank the member for what she brings to this House. I know her advocacy on a range of issues matters and does make a difference. On this side, Liberal MPs since 2015 have ensured that this government invests in infrastructure, invests in roads and highways. And I'll give you examples of northern infrastructure investments. We're talking about $10.5 million for the Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk highway rehabilitation in the Northwest Territories, $18 million for a new 10.5 million, for active transportation projects in Whitehorse and Watson Lake and Yukon, and projects in Nunavut as well. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member from Churchill, Kiiwetinoong, Aski.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Environment's recent comments that the Liberals have stopped investing in new road infrastructure and that the current system is perfectly adequate to respond to Canadians' needs is anti-Northern and anti-Indigenous. It's a death knell to isolated communities like Wasagamak, St. Teresa Point, and others who've been forced to call states of emergency because climate change has made their ice roads unreliable. Other Liberals have been actively engaged in finding solutions on this front. Will the Minister of Environment retract his comments, work with his colleagues and First Nations to build the all-weather road access they desperately need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, we know that infrastructure investment is absolutely vital to economic growth. And as part of our infrastructure policy, we're talking about almost 400 road and highway projects that have been invested at the federal level. And that's just one example of a fund that's at work. I've mentioned already northern examples. Let me give you the example, of course, of the Gordie Howe Bridge, which that side, the Conservatives, opposed, Mr. Speaker. $6 billion for the Gordie Howe Bridge, $153 million to enhance the Trans-Canada Highway in Newfoundland to make sure there's improvements there. The twinning on the highway, to be specific, will continue.
L'honorable député de Louis Hébert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 1954, the Quebec Winter Carnival has been synonymous with great fun for Quebecers, Canadians, and everyone through the world. Children meet Bonhomme, the Bonhomme des Neiges, for the first time. There's some grandparents who meet him for the umpteenth time. It also generates economic spin-off throughout the Quebec City region. Can the minister tell us how the government ensures the economic growth of the Carnival and Quebec in general? Mr. Speaker, Our government understands that economic spin-offs from the carnival contribute directly to the growth of businesses in the region. Unlike the Conservatives who want to cut the programs that fund festivals and refuse to take action on climate change, our government is investing more than $8 million to enhance the carnival tourist experience and combat climate change. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're making sure that Bonhomme Carnaval doesn't lose his job and that the Ice Palace doesn't melt.
The honourable member from Flamborough-Glanbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's radical environment minister is launching a war on cars. He said that their government has decided to stop investing in new road infrastructure. The radical minister did not clarify his remarks. Rather, he went even further, adding that these Liberals plan to block big projects. For example, the Highway 6 South expansion, which is so critical to the safety of people in my community. Why are these Liberals attacking commuters in the GTHA who are just trying to get to work?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
It's all a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to continue to hear the Conservatives talk about road infrastructure in particular, but infrastructure in general, which they continued to cut in their time in office and would do the same if they were back in power. He mentions the GTA, for example. Let me give you an example. $2.3 billion to build the Scarborough subway extension, $1.9 billion to build the Eglinton Crossway West extension, over $2 billion to build the Yonge North subway extension, $4 billion to build the Ontario line. There's other examples from the GTA. I thank the Liberal members of this caucus for advocating for all of this.
The honourable member from Flamborough-Glanbrook.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the previous Conservative government invested significantly in roads and highways in the GTA, Ontario, and Canada. So that non-answer doesn't cut it. Canadians already pay plenty of taxes, sending their money to Ottawa and expecting the government to build roads and infrastructure. Yet this Prime Minister and his radical minister would endanger the lives of Hamiltonians by not supporting projects like the Highway 6 South expansion. Will the Prime Minister stand up for Canadians and reject his radical environment minister?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Almost 3,000 road and bridge projects in Ontario, Mr. Speaker. That's just one example. I remember in this House of Commons when this government moved forward to talk with Windsor, to engage with Governor Rick Snyder in the state of Michigan years ago to make sure that the Gordie Howe Bridge would be a reality, and they were against it. $6 billion to make sure that's a reality. It's happening, and this government stands by that decision. The Conservatives have let down the people of Windsor. Thank you to the member for Windsor-Tecumseh for being there for his constituents.
The honourable member from Chilliwack Hope.
When the Prime Minister appointed a radical activist to be the Environment Minister, we knew that this Liberal government would be implementing extreme and divisive policies, but this latest Liberal announcement takes the cake. This may be the first time that any government anywhere at any time has promised to stop building roads, but that's exactly what the Liberals have done. This extreme new policy means that these Liberals are against adding more lanes to the Trans-Canada Highway between Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. Why do the Liberals want to kill these projects, which will help end gridlock and get people to work?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Very interesting, Mr. Speaker. He should have checked the record. It's stunning. As a BC MP, he voted against over $1 million for the 100-mile horse Loke Road Bridge replacement in that province. It's an example of Conservative hypocrisy on the other side. On the one hand, they want to stand for infrastructure investment and supporting roads. On the other hand, anytime this government has attempted to do that, they voted against it. We'll continue to work with provinces, with municipalities to make that a reality.
The honourable member from Chilliwack Hope.
This radical minister made it very clear that this Liberal government will no longer allow funding to go towards building roads. And it's no surprise that a guy that scaled the CN Tower or climbed on top of a premier's roof would come up with an extreme policy like building no more roads in this country. We need a strong road network to move our goods, to get our kids to school, and to get our workers to their jobs. So when will the Prime Minister condemn this radical policy from his extremist environment minister and stop punishing Canadians who need to drive their cars to live their lives?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
More more slogans from the other side, Mr. Speaker, more slogans. And you know why it's a slogan, Mr. Speaker? Because there's no sincerity. And there's no sincerity because they want to cut funding to cities. They want to cut funding to towns. Every time we've put measures on the table to make sure that municipalities are better supported and provinces are there with us, they've stood in the way of that. I've given examples here today, the Gordie Howe Bridge in my province. I just gave an example from his province. He's let down his constituents in the approach that he's taken. It's not a serious approach. It never was, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The proposed nuclear waste disposal site in Chalk River is an environmental abomination and pure social injustice. But I'm proud that the Bloc Québécois yesterday allowed Chief Lance Heyman to express the opposition of the Anishinaabe communities affected. And I'm proud to add the voice of the representatives of 4.5 million concerned Quebecers. Will the government finally say no to Chalk River and ensure that any project to bury nuclear waste does not unnecessarily threaten Indigenous peoples and Quebecers? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the Independent Commission only approves projects if they are safe for Canadians and safe for the environment. We've consulted Indigenous communities and others. As this file is subject to a judicial review, we are waiting for the results of the decision before we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. They want us to believe that the Canadian Commission is independent, but it's funny because the Governor and Council appoints the head of it. Burying nuclear waste 1 kilometre from the Outaouais River is putting the drinking water of the Anishinaabe and half of Quebec's population at unnecessary risk. We're talking about 1 million cubic metres of radioactive waste. It's not a compost bin in your backyard. The Montreal Metropolitan Community is against Chalk River. The city of Gatineau is against Chalk River. The Indigenous communities concerned are against the Chalk River project. Environmentalists are against as well. So when will the Minister finally say no to this project that threatens our health and that of the environment? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, it's incredible that the Bloc Québécois doesn't want to recognise the independence of a nuclear safety commission that approves only projects that follow consultations, including with Indigenous peoples. Natural Resources Canada has no role to play, and so consultations have occurred. If this file is approved, we will move forward. We continue to work together with Indigenous peoples and various communities to make sure that the project is viable.
Honourable Member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, a few months ago I asked the Minister of the Environment why, after 3 years, has Parks Canada not replaced the federal bridge in Bolsover? The Minister, of course, answered in typical Liberal fashion, promised to get back to the House and never actually did, but now we know why. News broke earlier this week that the Liberals have decided to stop funding new roads and bridges. And just like that, Parks Canada quietly confirms that the bridge will not be replaced. Leaving this village permanently cut in half is absolutely unacceptable. When will the Minister get his head out of the clouds, do his job, and get the bridge fixed?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
I know that member, and I've known him for many years to be someone who brings a nonpartisan approach, but such is the approach of the Leader of the Opposition that even someone like him has taken a decidedly a partisan approach to such critical issues. What do we see? 3,000 or nearly 3,000 road and bridge projects at $2.1 billion funded by this government, but they've supported none of it, Mr. Speaker. I just mentioned the Ontario example of the Gordie Howe Bridge. They're talking about building bridges. We'll continue to do whatever we can to support communities large and small throughout this province.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's radical Environment Minister is waging open war on cars. He declared that his government had decided to stop investing in new road infrastructure. And he didn't clarify his remarks. He went even further by adding that the Liberal government was going to block major projects. Mr. Speaker, the Radical Environment Minister is going to block major projects like the third link between Quebec City and Lévis. Why is the Liberal government attacking workers in Lévis, Quebec, who are trying simply to get to work? The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons. What the member across the way knows full well is that this government, over our time on this side of the House, has invested billions upon billions of dollars in infrastructure, in road infrastructure throughout Quebec, throughout Canada, and we will continue to do so, as we have done in Kamouraska, for example, with Road 195, and what we will no doubt continue to do so in his riding. And he'll probably vote against all these projects, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, when was the last time a radical minister and muzzled minister drove through the Lévis-Quebec region without his limousine? Building the third link won't be a luxury because it's a necessity. Quebecers in remote regions pay taxes and send their money all the way to Ottawa, which is supposed to build reliable roads and infrastructures for them as well. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister defend the interests of Quebecers in remote regions instead of following the anti-third link folly of his radical environment minister?
Not take, please not, I
would like to ask all members to make sure that they hold their tongue when it is not their turn to speak. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House. The Honourable Member knows full well that this government has invested billions upon billions of dollars in road infrastructure projects, highways in Quebec, for example, and throughout Canada. We're the second largest country in the world. We know full well, Mr. Speaker, that we have to invest to build better roads for our constituents, for Canadians and for businesses. But every time this member votes against our investments in highways, he votes in systematically against everything that the government is doing for Quebec. He needs to make sure that people know this.
The Honourable Member from Vancouver Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I wish a happy Black History Month to residents in my riding of Vancouver Centre. I want to highlight their contributions to economic development and job creation in BC. Shout out to the Black Business Association of BC, an umbrella organization of small businesses that work to help Black entrepreneurs thrive and expand despite the systemic barriers they still face. Can the Minister of Small Business tell us how our government helps Black entrepreneurs to overcome these barriers and succeed in Canada?
The Honourable Minister for Small Business.
Mr. Speaker, we know that building a more inclusive economy means building a stronger economy. That's why our government created the first ever Black Entrepreneurship Program. This historic $265 million investment has supported over 9,000 Black entrepreneurs across this country and strengthens the ecosystem that supports them. It is disappointing that the Leader of the Opposition and the Conservatives have voted against this support and turned their backs on Black small business entrepreneurs. On this side of the House, including the member from Vancouver Centre, we will keep being there for Black entrepreneurs. Happy Black History Month.
The Honourable Member from Perth Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister easily found $60 million for his ArriveCan app, but he still wants to quadruple the carbon tax on gas, groceries, and home eating. While the typical Canadian family will pay $700 more to put food on the table this year, this Prime Minister is raising the carbon tax by 23% on April 1st. After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, more and more Canadians are struggling to make ends meet and to pay for food, heat, and housing. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost or the tax. Will the Prime Minister give Canadians some relief and axe the tax?
Hear, hear. Well done. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the Conservatives who want to take money away from Canadians, we're putting money back in the pockets of Canadians with rebates. So I have a question for my honourable friend. Will you cut the $1,100 for Ontario families? Or how about the $1,800 for Alberta families? How about the $1,200 that Manitoba families are going to get back? You want to deny climate change. You want
The honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
The Prime Minister's NDP Liberal friends got rich turning the Arrive Scam app into a $60 million grift for an $80,000 app. But if hurting taxpayers for personal gain of Liberals wasn't enough, now this Prime Minister is going to increase the cost of everything on April 1st when he increases the carbon tax by 23%. Nova Scotians will pay $2,100 more than they get back for this carbon tax. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So when will Liberals stop hurting Canadians and axe the carbon tax?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, let's focus on what Canadians are actually getting back. In 2023-24, Ontario, $976, Alberta, $1,500, Saskatchewan, $1,300, Manitoba, $1,000, Newfoundland, $900, Nova Scotia, $700, PEI, $700, New Brunswick, $500, Mr. Speaker. These are rebates, and the Conservatives want to...
Order, colleagues. The Honourable Minister has 12 seconds left on the clock.
Mr. Speaker, it doesn't make sense. It's not common sense to deny climate change and to cut money from Canadian families.
The Honourable Member from Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
After 8 years of this Liberal Prime Minister, costs are up. Already, a typical family of four will pay $700 more in groceries in 2024 compared to last year. I've talked to moms who are skipping meals simply so they can feed their children. Yet for this extremist NDP Liberal coalition, this isn't enough.
It's gross.
They are going to continue punishing Canadians, raising the carbon tax on April 1st. So the question is simple. Will they do the right thing and axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister for Workforce Development.
Speaker, we will do the right thing, continue to fight climate change, and make sure that Albertans have more money in their pockets than they are paying in the carbon pricing. Why, Mr. Speaker? $1,800 to a family of four, and if you get the rural top-up, 20% top-up, $2,160. Let's dial that back, Mr. Speaker. $450 every 3 months into the...
Colleagues, the reason why I've stood up the last couple of times is because the chair has had difficulty in hearing the answer from the honourable members. I'm going to ask honourable members who sit near the minister to please hold your comments back until you have the time to ask a question. The honourable minister has 12 seconds left on the clock if he chooses to use it.
Mr. Speaker, I choose to use the 12 seconds because Albertans need to know falsehoods from the Conservatives don't pay the bills. Canada Carbon Rebate helps. That's why we put it in place.
The honourable member from Humber River, Black Creek.
Mr. Speaker, strong, vibrant communities are good for everyone. In my riding, Maxmar Window Coverings, led by Norbert Morocco, has been operating since 2007 and continues to help my ridings like mine and Canada a better place to live, work, and to raise a family. A key ingredient for any successful business, of course, is drive and determination to grow and keep building on past successes. Anyone who's met Norbert knows that his business has that in spades. Can the Minister of International Trade share with this House how our government is supporting businesses who want to grow and expand their businesses for new markets? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is a trading nation and our businesses create great jobs for our workers. While the Conservatives vote against the trade agreement with Ukraine, we will keep helping businesses grow with confidence. And what a success story this is. A Canadian company selling internationally. Our government is making those investments to open doors, and in this case, open blinds. On this side of the House, I'm proud to work with member from Humber River Black Creek, and I want to thank her for her incredible leadership as the chair of the Trade Committee, and I hope this business is going to consider exporting to Ukraine.
Absolutely. The honourable member from Edmonton Griesba.
A new report on rent prices across Canada confirms what Canadians already know. Rent prices are skyrocketing while real estate CEOs are making record profit. And which city had the rental prices go up the fastest? Well, my city of Edmonton. And that's because the Liberals are leaving it up to Danielle Smith and corporate developers who are failing to build the homes that people can actually afford. Mr. Speaker, when will this government act to lower rent so people in Edmonton have a place to call home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
$470 million, Mr. Speaker. That is the amount that the federal government has allocated through, among other things, the Canada Housing Benefit, which was recently topped up. We will continue to support Canadians going through a difficult time and make sure that we are working with different orders of government to ensure that that outcome is a real one, a lasting one, a meaningful one for Canadians who are challenged right now. I would also point to other measures that we're taking to ensure more homes are being built, lifting the GST off of purpose-built rentals, for example, making sure there's low-interest loans that are available to builders. That is how we get more supply on the market.
The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, February 26th, the 13th Ministerial of the World Trade Organization will open in Abu Dhabi. And amazingly, just 8 weeks ago, that same country closed on an ambitious climate agenda from COP28, referred to as the United Arab Emirates Consensus. Will this government use that synchronicity, get in there and make sure that the 13th Trade Ministerial is a climate ministerial that makes the WTO back off climate deals and let us do the work to deliver on Paris commitments?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for her advocacy, particularly on the environment. Canada is a trading nation, and later this month I will be representing Canada at the World Trade Organization Ministerial. And as a trading nation, our businesses and our investors and our workers depend on a rules-based trading system with the World Trade Center at its core. While there, I will continue and always fight for climate change while we grow the economy and create great green jobs. So I want to thank the Honourable Member for that important question. I look forward to making sure that Canada continues to do the work of fighting climate change.
Bravo. And so brings to the end of question period for today. But this is